Okay, here we go with the president, the big face of our country, yet Article 2 in the Constitution. And just a reminder in terms of comparison to Article 1, this is pretty short in terms of what the president is allowed to do, but they are the leader of the free world. And that is still a very big issue because of what that means, how much they are able to do. With the imperial presidency that it has become, they have taken the powers that are expressed in the Constitution and they have increased the size of it, similar to how the necessary and proper clause allowed Congress to do it. The president has done the exact same thing, growth of the executive office. But again, with the president, what do we expect out of the president is a difficult thing to define because of all those paradoxes we want. We want somebody who is powerful, somebody who is a good-hearted person. They're going to do good. They're not going to go in and ruin things. They're going to go do good things. Now, we are also fearful of somebody who is really effective and they do their job well. We're not really sure if that's the right balance, and that paradox is created. But why do we have a president? Why is it Article 2? Well, we were fearful of a bunch of different things. And going back to the beginnings, we wanted somebody in power. We were fearful of having nobody, anarchy, the chaos, the lack of trust amongst people. But we didn't want a monarch. We were just leaving the king, so we really didn't want that. And the balance then was a president who wasn't really in complete control, but they were still the head of the country, the chief executive. And because of that, we started to get into the checks and balances. The Senate being separate from the president allowed the advice and consent of treaties, of appointments, and then just the general checks and balances of legislative powers. And because of that, there are some interesting bypasses that the president has taken in order to avoid the confrontations that Congress might be able to influence. And the original concern was, how do we elect the president? And the solution was, of course, the Electoral College. And we know that they need 270 electoral votes. And if there is no majority hitting 270, it does go to the House. But that was a way that they addressed those fears of the founding fathers. We don't want anarchy or monarchy. We need a balance. And we can't have them picked by members of the Senate, because then all they have to do is appeal to those people who are in the Senate, and you have to have a little bit of a connection to the people, therefore the Electoral College. Now, how long do they serve? Well, that's a very recent thing. We have had only one president who has been elected to more than 2 terms, and that was FDR. He was actually elected to serve multiple terms. He ended up being the longest serving president, and there never will be anybody who serves longer than them unless there's another amendment that changes the 22nd. They have a 2-year term max, and that is allowing for 10 years, which we talked about in class. So just thinking back to what happened a couple weeks ago, January 20th, that is Inauguration Day. And Inauguration Day is January 20th because of the 20th Amendment. And with the 20th Amendment, you experienced something, if you were able to get home and watch from those amazing exams that you had for 3 days. It is rare, and they mention it multiple times on TV that this doesn't really happen. This transition of power in the world is extremely rare, where you in fact have President Obama and President Trump walking out together to then go to the Capitol to swear in the next president, and then all the former presidents. That is extremely rare, where there's that peaceful exchange, and there really isn't any feuding as that happens. Now, this is not going to be a historical lesson for you in terms of presidents for what I would expect you to know all presidents, what they're going through. Not exactly. But it's just like anything else. Historically, things have changed because of certain presidents. So one of the big things that we continue to bring up is Nixon. Well, Nixon has changed quite a bit. And so just to think about those general changes that have kind of occurred over time. And without really thinking about it, when I say the imperial presidency, I hope you think of that as a new thing, where it hasn't always been the case that the president is in complete control. They really didn't have a lot of power up until recently. Congress really was Article 1, so appropriately, but they are the ones who controlled a lot of the power. Since the New Deal with FDR booming the size of the bureaucracy and the government agencies, continuing with World War II and the fears of the Cold War, the fears of other communist influences, we have really allowed the president become this imperial president. Now, the official requirements, and this is, again, a pretty big section of the Constitution, are right here. They have to be 35 years old. That's older than both chambers of the House and the Senate. A natural born citizen. This is a little bit different than members of Congress where they have to be citizens for a set number of years. This is they have to be a natural born citizen. So this clause was actually addressing people who maybe were born in Britain and then moved over or something like that to prevent that British influence in American government as the head. And then lastly, they have to reside for the 14 previous years in the United States. So in other words, you can't be born born a U.S. citizen because of your parents and then move to the U.S. and run for the office of the presidency. You have to be established in the U.S. for 14 years. Most have a political background. Of course, we see President Trump, who hasn't really had any political background. He's ran for the presidency before, but not under of the two-party ticket. And that's mainly because most are from other areas. State governors tend to be the most common. Obama was a senator, but the senators often run into trouble because if you're going to be a president, your senatorial record really can't be that open to debate. So you almost have to be a liked senator, but not an extremely effective senator in order to have a chance of running for the president. So those powers that are a little bit shorter for us than the powers that are given to Congress are still important. And Article 2 does establish them, but they also are a little bit ambiguous. And the one that I really want you to think about that I sort of explained was they have in the clause the ability or duty, to execute the laws faithfully. So the faithful execution of the laws. What does that allow them to do? Well, they are in charge of executing the laws, first off, as the executive branch. But that allows them to do a lot. This is where those kind of inherent, the informal powers come from. So this clause right here, the duty to execute laws faithfully, is more so the connection and parallel to the necessary and proper clause of the legislative branch. The commander-in-chief is similar. I mean, they control the army, but with our check, as I brought up, we have a check from the legislative branch of declaring war. Well, the president over history and recently has thrown troops into different areas without a declaration of war. The biggest example of this would have been in Vietnam, where the troops were sent and there was war never declared against Vietnam. So they passed the War Powers Act, which established a set amount of time for troops to be in certain situations. 48 hours, they had to tell Congress why they thought it necessary to send troops somewhere. And if Congress didn't declare war within 60 days, they had to start pulling out troops, and they had a full 90 days, and they would have to be gone. However, that has never been challenged. The president still controls the troops and still can send troops, and the War Powers Act has never been called into action by Congress. The biggest power that the president has, though, is that approval rating. This right here, the greatest source of power, it is from public opinion. They need to have a favorable approval rating, and people will pay attention to them. And it's persuasion. It really is. It's a persuasion thing where the politics of the situation allow the president to communicate, work with people, and then because of that, they're able to be an effective leader and they can accomplish their specific agendas. So a little bit more with power specifically, signing a bill into a law. These are parts of the Constitution. A veto message, that is where they get a bill at their desk, and what do they do with it? They veto it. They veto it, send it back to Congress, telling them what was bad about it. Now, of course, there's a final check, the override, which is extremely rare. That doesn't exactly happen. Pocket veto? Well, number one, pocket veto means that the bill is done. They would do this maybe at the last day before summer vacation. Congress gives the president a bill, and they don't like it, and they'll say, I'm not going to sign it. I've got 10 days and you're not going to be able to do anything about it. So the bill is pocket vetoed. On the flip side of that, if they are in session, it automatically becomes a bill without its signature from the president. And that is where you have to consider what would be the purpose in that. Don't attach a name to it. You know the outcome, but you just don't attach a name. The line item veto, not constitutional. So thinking back to the Constitution chapter, this would allow the president to sign certain portions of a bill while vetoing others, but that was ruled unconstitutional in the 90s. The Congress tried to give it to Clinton, and they said that overstretched the powers of the president, that they can't legislate by altering bills. But they do have signing statements. Signing statements are when they sign a bill, essentially, but they also attach a message saying this is a perfect bill, and this is my vision of how we're going to carry out and execute this law that the House and the Senate just passed on to me. So it's kind of like the big rally and promotion of the bill that they signed. Now, the expansion of power is kind of a big focus. So where does the growth come from? The New Deal, the people looking for economic help, then the wars with World War II, and then finally with the growth of Vietnam and Nixon with what they call an imperial presidency, it established the growth of the executive office. And with the growth of the executive office comes more agencies, more jobs, and more distance from representatives and senators for how they actually control the government. And here we do have our full presidential powers, and these are the ones that are from the Constitution regarding both legislative, national power, administrative powers, everything. So, and just looking at this, national security powers, remember you do have that reference of the guide between the diplomacy forum with the congressional to executive checks, which is going to be very helpful for you, but they're just kind of listed here. So, of course, commander-in-chief, armed forces. But the Senate has to declare war. Making treaties, nominating ambassadors. Those are presidential powers with the Senate on the other end. And then, of course, head of state, receiving ambassadors, which definitely the recognition of other nations does improve relationships. Legislative powers, they're the chief legislators. So to begin with, they are in control of the State of the Union. Suggestions to Congress on what laws should be. Those are two powers that are often overlooked, where it's really just a speech type thing, but that is from the Constitution giving them that right to do so. Now, the veto, the signing, those are kind of, they're separate, but it's the same end. You either sign it or you veto it. Both are from the Constitution. Now, this one again is the big power. Take care that laws be faithfully executed. That is the one that stretches the powers of the president, where it's not just those that are clearly listed. It goes well beyond that. And then the judicial powers that you can see, those are the ones that we sort of just addressed in class, the reprieves, pardons for the federal crimes. And it's not exactly something that you would see impact much, but Nixon is one who was pardoned by President Ford, where there were going to be charges against him, and he was pardoned for those crimes. But then the one with judicial power that is more important, nominating federal judges, and that is Supreme Court justices, one of which was just nominated, but then also many other judges from around the country to fill federal judgeships, which we'll see in a couple chapters. So now the real connections to the president, the White House office, for how the president goes about their business, their decisions, their speeches, their actions, everything. And it really does come from the White House office staff. This is the closest group of people to the president. They are the closest ascendees. Most of the people that you'll see here are working because they were connected to Donald Trump on his campaign. So Conway, Spicer, Bannon were all connected to Trump on his campaign. So it's kind of like the close personal assistants, those who helped you along the way. And they do not have to go through the Senate confirmation process. They're on their own. They're just appointed because they're handpicked. They are not a member of the cabinets, the government agencies. They're a part of the White House office staff. So a big difference there. And they do not have to go through the confirmation process. Now, just the general structures that are talked about within the book and the chapter, and they all have different different weaknesses really for how the president will go about listening to different inputs and different suggestions on what course of action they should take with any given piece of legislation or any issue that's in front of them. The first is the pyramid structures, where really it's just kind of a, okay, so everybody has an opinion and it reports up to their leader. Then that level of leaders, they all have their opinions and then they report to their leader. So it's kind of a pyramid. You just report up, best idea continues, best idea continues, best idea continues, and you hope that yours makes it through the bracket and gets to the president. Well, that is where the chief of staff listens to the people underneath to get the best piece of information. But that cuts out the source of the input, which can lead to misinformation. The president might not get all the pieces that were there for how a given policy should be carried out. The circular structure is basically just a free-for-all. I want to listen to everybody. I want to listen to my assistants. I want to listen to my staffers. I want to listen to my cabinet heads, everything. This is good because you are allowing for input, but then at the same time, you're going to get confused. That's just a lot of information. So you're going to get confused. People are going to be in competition with one another, and it can lead to a decision being made that isn't fully thought out. Ad hoc is kind of the last option. That's just kind of thrown together. It's okay, I want this, and this person together. Boom, you're the committee that I'm putting together on education, policy, and what really should go into school lunches. And if that happens, then because it was handpicked by a president, who might be the expert? Somebody might be the expert that isn't actually a part of that informal committee, and therefore they might be cut out of the discussion when really they could have been a lot of input, a good resource. So these three aren't really, this or that or this or that for a president. Usually it's a combination of them. Jimmy Carter was really big on circular just because he wanted to include everybody, but most presidents use some combination of all of them, where maybe on certain issues they are more circular, open to everybody's input, but maybe on others they're more pyramid structure, probably national security and that sort of stuff. But to be a part of the White House office staff, you have to be connected to the president. And they are the ones who have the biggest impact on what presidents are going to do. So President Trump's decisions are in large part due to the people that surround him. In fact, actually, with Donald Trump and recently criticisms of this, Steve Bannon here has been criticized for being the one who has actually made decisions, and Donald Trump took offense to that and tweeted that he makes his own decisions. And that shows you that people do recognize that the staff is very involved in the decisions that Trump's making. And people do have a problem with that because these people are not confirmed by the Senate. So it's basically the hand-picked advisors of the president, and then there's no check on them being involved in what Trump does. So going on to people who, though, could be approved by the Senate, and that is one right here, the Office of Management and Budget. But all of these fall under the category of the executive office of the president. So you can kind of think of this as like the executive office, this umbrella of people. So at the top you have the president, and then who are the different people that are going to help them on a regular basis. The White House office staff is up there, but they're just the assistants. So they're under the umbrella. President Trump is going to go to them more regular than anybody else, but they also are not an agency. They aren't a government agency where they would have to be approved. The OMB, though, does, the Office of Management and Budget. So to begin, I think you know that it has to deal with budget. So they are in charge of helping the president develop their budget originally and giving suggestions to Congress so they can continue have that back and forth discussion for how they want to evaluate their policies and what impact the budget will have on them. But then they also deal with the government agencies where they investigate the different proposals from government agencies. So they do have a bigger role than just the budget. Then there are other independent agencies that are connected to the president where they're regulatory commissions that carry out like the business activity. So National Security Council is one, Council of Economic Advisors, and they all help the president with what they're really doing. They're a little bit more specialized than just the staff, but they still have input on different situations. The cabinet is another big section of the executive office of the president because going back to this umbrella quickly, they're also going to be somebody that the president looks to for support. If they're going back here even to the different structures, they're going to listen to the Secretary of Defense on defense strategy. Well, that's because they're a part of the cabinet. There are 15 different executive departments, and they were established originally. There were 4, and then they just kind of grow with need. They grow with need. The most recent being the Department of Homeland Security, and that was the direct result of 9/11. But they continue to grow with need, and with each one, they have more specialization. So there are 15. Most of them are secretaries. We are currently in the confirmation process. Jeff Sessions was just approved as Attorney General. That is the only one that doesn't have a secretary name. Really, does that matter? No, doesn't. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos was just approved by the Senate as well. So they head the different departments. The difference here, though, is that these are not exactly people that that Trump is connected to. They might have some connection, but unlike the staffers, the direct connections, people who run the executive departments, the cabinet heads, in other words, so the 14 secretaries and the attorney general, are there more so because they have a little bit of expertise. They aren't typically politicians, but they do work with the government often. So, you could think of just quick, like what Betsy DeVos's background is. She has been affiliated with education reform, and her government experience is limited, but she has some government experiences. So they try to keep people away from the political arena, and they are able to focus on their specific task. Where she's had Republican connections with her husband running for governor. She's played an active role in the Michigan Republican Party, but she's not a politician. Government experience doesn't necessarily mean that she's a politician. Now, of course, this is different than Parliament. They are separate. They are not a part of the legislature. They are specialized in their area because the members of the legislature will often give them authority to make decisions in their specific area, like any of these: education, the energy, the labor, the agriculture. So the people who work for these agencies are going to be specialized in them. The cabinet heads, the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Secretary of Ed, they are going to focus on this specific thing, whereas a member of Congress is going to have to focus on all of them. Now, all of these 15, we're going to talk a lot about them in the bureaucracy chapter coming up next. But for now, these are all a part of the executive office of the president. And this is really where the government agencies begin. And you can see, just for reference here, for the line of succession, that's the 25th Amendment, remember, which is the vice president, then the Speaker of the House, then the president pro tempore, and then all of the cabinet heads by order of creation. So that means that boom, 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 you work your way down, and that would be the last person in line to be president currently. Okay, so here is your graphic of what I was talking about with the executive office, and the whole focus is to try to run things effectively. So some of them are more important than others, but they are all specialized with what they focus on. So depending on the different area, the different purpose, the different policy, whatever, it's going to be a different group that often gets more of an input. So the National Security Council, they are going to deal with national security. The Council of Economic Advisors, the economy, Office of Management Budget, the budget, and then also the way that different agencies are working. So what else do they do? Well, the presidents see them first. They probably see them last at night. They're the ones who give the most pertinent information to the president, and that is why they have a big influence on them, because they could prevent them from receiving information, but then they also could give them extra information that maybe would sway them in a certain direction for how they're going to go about their business. Now, the First Lady is a little bit different, where they have actually an office, kind of like the White House office staff. They have a staff also for the First Lady. But the First Lady doesn't really have a role in government other than they get to be kind of the figurehead of a specific issue. So for Michelle Obama, it was childhood obesity, the school lunches. Then you can think, Nancy Reagan was the war on drugs and the Just Say No campaign. So it'll be interesting to see if the first lady, um, is going to select a single issue that she chooses to focus on, or if maybe she's just going to be more of an overall support for different policies that Donald Trump is pursuing. And it'd be kind of a general input, and then trying to convince people or promote or get support in that way. And that, again, really, if you have to think about what that could do for a president, is if the first lady has an objective, has a mission that is effective, then that could also improve in the approval rating of the president. So again, this is not a history lesson, but I think each president has done different things, and each president tends to try to implement their own policies, their own reorganization. Basically, if you kind of were to break all these down, they're all different, and they all did different things for how they viewed the presidency. And really, that comes into an interpretation of what the Constitution allows them to do. So Eisenhower was a military general. That's how they're going to rule. Then you have Kennedy. That was more charisma, the persuasion. That's why he was a little bit of favored person in the White House, because of his charisma. Then you kind of get down here with Johnson and Nixon and Ford, and they're the ones who really started to change the way that the presidency operated. But then you get Carter, who was the outsider, the Washington outsider, seeking to see change, which is a little bit of how kind of Trump had so much appeal, is that he was an outsider. He's going to drain the swamp and get rid of those lifelong politicians and change the way people thought about politics in D.C. by not being somebody who was connected to all the other nuances of how government operates. Now, as a president looks to who they're going to talk to, there really are three main audiences. The politicians that are in D.C., the other leaders that are in D.C., the members of Congress, whatever. Then the grassroots, the party activists. So as the head of the party, the chief of the party, they also need to be able to communicate with them. They need to be able to communicate them their policies, and for the most part align with what they're going to do. And then also they need to be aware of the public. Well, what are the criticisms? What are the opportunities that they have in order to please them, to improve the approval rating that they might have? And of the three, the most important by far really is fellow politicians and other leaders that are in D.C. So when they're talking, who are they talking to? Most of the time, they really are talking to other politicians and leaders, because they're the ones who are going to actually make the action happen. So while all three are dependent on presidential recommendations, it really is the politicians and leaders who receive the most attention from the president as they're talking. So with that power of persuasion, and that, the likability power of persuasion really, again, is the huge tool at the disposal of the president in order to accomplish their agenda, their proposed agenda. It goes along with the fact that they are in a perfect spot to do that. The White House, again, is one building representing one person, really representing the entire country. So the White House has an around-the-clock staff of journalists, the White House press corps, which we talked about with the media chapter, and they are always there for whatever the president wants. So it's so easy for media exposure for the president. They're able to use that position as an amazing podium to speak. And that's what the bully pulpit is a reference to, is the fact that it's an amazing podium for them to be able to pursue their agenda by getting people to listen to whatever it is they want to listen to. And that is, similar to the idea that the going public or getting pressure, improving their approval rating is going to impact members of Congress to vote along their lines, and it really does. They have multiple things that we looked at that really do impact the approval rating, but politicians in general pay attention to the presidential approval rating. And then, of course, senators and representatives do as well. So as we looked at the approval rating, there are numerous factors, and for the most part, they're out of the president's control because there are so many unforeseen circumstances that might arise through the course of their tenure. But they obviously, there are some general trends that I asked you to pay attention to. Number one, over time, it's very likely that it's going to decline, at least a little. It's going to decline a little. It's going to start high. It's going to start a little higher because of the honeymoon period. There's kind of that general consideration that is given. And so these jots, these turns, whatever, they all symbolize something beyond just what they have control over. They're all a part of something much bigger than just what they do have the ability to control. So as we look at also the responses from members of Congress and how they relate to the president, you also have to look at the fact that they're not as successful as they would like to be the entire time. I mean, obviously, we have checks and balances for a reason. So just because the president is well-liked doesn't mean that Congress is just going to go along with whatever they say. Now, this graph is depicting when the president actually takes a stance on something. In other words, they maybe deliver it in the State of the Union, their specific stance on an issue where they recommend consideration on a bill or something of that matter. This is depicting what is the percentage of that bill going to be passed and how people respond to it that way. So there are many factors that go into this as well, but again, it's just kind of one of those things that relies on multiple factors. It's not just one or the other. So a few final things to talk about. The powers that aren't necessarily clear as others in the Constitution. First, the executive privilege. That's confidentiality. So the president's going to hear quite a lot of things throughout their time. I mean, President Trump has already alluded to the fact that he's heard more about national security than he ever thought was possible related to terrorism and terrorism threats. But he doesn't have to disclose those. You have to kind of think of the president working for somebody. I mean, the president is essentially, we are the boss of the president. We put them in that position. Popular sovereignty allows us to do that. But there is no requirement for the president to disclose to us, let alone, or to members of Congress, let alone us. So they have the ability to keep comments in confidence, do things in confidence without having to share that with other individuals. But it isn't absolute, as that kind of came out with U.S. versus Nixon, where there is a system of confidentiality with executive privilege, but they don't have to worry about it in terms of extreme issues. Just because the president is saying something doesn't mean that it's automatically covered by executive privilege. The last thing that the president has at their disposal, really, that has been addressed from Nixon, was impoundment of funds. So Congress controls the money. They're the wallet keepers. They get to decide where the money is going to go. But the impoundment of funds would mean then that the president doesn't actually spend it. So with the impoundment of funds, this is kind of like going behind the backs of members of Congress, where they're just going to say, no, I'm not going to spend the money that you told me to spend. And this is really one of those things that bothered Congress. So we kind of talked about how Nixon became rather the enemy of members of Congress. And one of the big ones was the War Powers Act, which defined when they could send troops and for how long, and if there was no declaration of war, how quickly they had to bring the troops back. Within 60 days, they had to start, and with 90, they had to be fully back. But then these two as well. The Budget Reform Act and Impoundment Control Act tried to express a concern for this in saying that members of Congress had allocated money to the president to spend, and if they were not going to spend it as they wanted, they had to have a pretty good reason in order to do that. And really what they were getting at is that it had to be spent how they wanted it to be spent. So the 25th Amendment is the last amendment that we have to talk about with the president, and that really is line of succession. We've talked about that quite a bit. It's not really that commonly used. However, we know that it's played a role. We have 8 that have died in office, 4 have been assassinated, and those 4, by the way, are all right here. You can see we have first President Lincoln, President Garfield, President McKinley, President Kennedy, they all were killed while they were in office. And that was before the 25th Amendment. It took the president dying of JFK to actually establish who is going to take over. And that was where the VP gets there. Now, if the president is ill, the VP is also there. And what that means is, like, if they were to have surgery, or maybe they weren't dead, but they couldn't perform their capacities, then they could rule that under the 25th Amendment, the cabinet had the power to decide that they were unfit to perform their duties. This is all still a part of the 25th Amendment, where they get to decide that the president can't perform their functions. So by declaring the president unfit, the VP would step in if the cabinet had decided it in the first place. And with the fact that if the VP steps in, or if both of them were to maybe die, the speaker would step in. Well, who becomes the VP? That would be from the new president. They get to choose who they want for a VP, but it does have to be confirmed by the chambers, both the House and the Senate, to support that. Last thing really is the impeachment. We know where that starts. It has to start in the House. The trial for removal is in the Senate, with the Chief Justice the person in charge. Now, there really haven't been any big issues with the president in terms of removal. Both Johnson and Clinton were up for the trial, but neither one were removed. More judges have actually been impeached than presidents, and that's really because there are more. I mean, right now we have federal judges in the hundreds, so there are quite a few of those that really are up for impeachment throughout history, and they have been removed from office as well. There haven't been any Supreme Court justices, but federal judges, circuit district, they have been removed from their positions, which really is the only way for them to get fired, because they have the life tenure. It's either they get impeached and removed, they die, or they quit. So those are your options. And here we go. We are at the end now. This is just a quick list of those 8 who were not able to finish their terms. So you can see that we, again, had 4 who died from assassinations. The other ones were leaving before their terms were ending. So death, resignation. So when that happens, it did kind of throw things in a loop for a time, but the 25th Amendment established that and controlled any concerns afterwards. So just a quick recap of the amendments before we're out. We have the 25th, line of succession. 22nd, you are limited to 2 terms. You can complete 1/2 partial and then 2 terms max. The 20th, inauguration day, and then the 12th, which set up the Electoral College. Now, you should have your review handy before you are leaving. Remember, questions and terms are for Monday, quiz on Tuesday, where we will spend all day Monday getting ready and making sure that you are fit to go with everything that you will need. If you have any questions over the weekend, let me know. But otherwise, be safe, be smart, and